Thank you, musicians, for that song. Well done. 1 Samuel chapter 2, if you'll join me, if you have your Bibles tonight. If you don't have a Bible, you might be able to reach in front of you and get one out of the pocket there in front of in the pew. But so far, we've seen the spotlight has been mainly on Hannah throughout 1 Samuel, first couple of chapters, first chapter and a half. But the story, we're going to pick up in verse 12, might back up to verse 11 there because that's where we left off last week, just to kind of jog our memories. But the story now seems to pan out a little bit, and Hannah is not necessarily the focus from this point forward. In fact, what happens over the rest of chapter 2 is that the spotlight and the focus now turns to two families, which Hannah is one of those families, but we're going to center our thoughts around Elkanah as the head of the family and also Eli as the head of his families. And this is going to be a part 1 and a part 2 message. I'm not planning on keeping you here for 45 minutes tonight to try to cover it. I would rather us slow down and enjoy it and take our time with it and actually learn something than trying to drink water out of a fire hydrant, just jam it. And we don't want to do that. So we're going to slow down, and might be a little bit shorter message tonight, but that's okay. The focus there in verse 11 and 12, it's Elkanah and Eli. And so over the rest of the chapter, it's going to be a story about two families. And so you see in verse 11, Elkanah went to his house at Ramah, but the child, and that's Samuel, ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. So right there in verse 11, it kind of introduces us to the two families. You have Eli's family, who is the priest at Shiloh. You have Elkanah, who lives at Ramah. He has a very faithful and devout wife who is a woman of prayer. She's a worshiper. She was barren. She has asked the Lord for a child. God has answered that prayer. She has responded in praise in the first part of chapter 2. And now they go their separate ways. Samuel is left there at Shiloh with Eli. Now, the writer of 1 Samuel starts to tell us some things about Eli. And I want to go ahead and warn you, this is not going to be pleasant when it comes to Eli. In fact, I find it disappointing. I find it a little bit depressing to think about one of the supposed to be a religious, supposed to be a spiritual leader, supposed to be a spiritual example, and he is not at all a good example to follow. Not at all. It says there in verse 12, the sons of Eli were corrupt. So that gives you an idea of what they're all about. Think about it like this. We're in the time of the Judges. And in the book of Judges, there is a phrase that's repeated 4 or 5 times. And here it is. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That's repeated in the book of Judges. It's like the theme. It's like the background. We are in the time of the Judges here. The time of the Judges is overlapped into what we're looking at here. So Eli, this spiritual leader, he does not live up to God's standard. Now, first thing I want you to see is the ministry of Eli's family. Again, a priest of Israel, a spiritual leader, supposed to be a spiritual example, and here is what you have leading you. You have a corrupt priesthood. Look at verse 12. Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord. Well, you know what corruption is. It means that they are deceptive. It means that they cut corners. It means that they are not, they're not wholesome. They're just not right. They lie, they deceive, they do those kinds of things. They steal probably. In fact, you'll see next week that it gets quite graphic, actually, on some of the things they do with women. It's pretty gross. But simply in verse 12, they did not know the Lord. And what that is talking about is they do not have the knowledge of the Lord, enough knowledge of the Lord to really care about how they're doing things. They don't care. They don't know. They don't care. They're not in close relationship with God at all. I would even go so far as to say they're probably lost. That's probably what that phrase means. But at the very least, I'm not here to judge their salvation. I'm not, 100% sure. Only God knows those things. However, what we can say is they are not acquainted with the ways of God. And they do not live that out. But notice in verse 13 and 15, 13 through 15, you see this, it's kind of an example of their corruption and their lack of knowledge about the Lord. Notice in 13 it says, and the priest's custom with the people was. Now, that's not the prescribed custom. In other words, this is not what the law says. This is how they were doing it. And let's remind ourselves of that phrase. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. They're going to do it their way. Okay? So their way is corrupt and their way is informed by a lack of knowledge. All right? So this is how they did things. Was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant, and that's probably the sons of Eli. Okay? In fact, in the Hebrew, it means junior priest. So it's probably Eli's sons. Hophni and Phinehas is their names. We were introduced to them in chapter 1, but they're going to come back into the story probably next week. It says, would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook in his hand while the meat was boiling. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. And so the first thing that it's trying to communicate to you, and I know this language is kind of difficult, like what's going on and what are they trying to say? Well, what they're trying to say is they're doing it wrong. And basically the priest took all the meat. They took what they wanted to take. But that's not what the Mosaic Law, how it says to do it. In fact, you'll find, I had to dig all this up. I'm not an expert on the Mosaic Law and how all the details of sacrifices. But this is what I found. Leviticus chapter 7 in verses 28 through 36, and I'm kind of summarizing what it says there. It's a long, you know how it is. It's very procedural in the law, and it goes into great detail. And take the right foot and do this, and trim this and do that. Well, I'm boiling it down to, this is what it says. The breast and the right thigh of sacrificial animals the priest is allowed to have that. That's all they get. And that's how they eat. Okay? So they're allowed to have the right thigh and the breast. Thank you. That's their part. Not how it's done in 1 Samuel chapter 2 when a priest servant would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook, and while the meat was boiling, he would thrust it into the pan and would take for himself all that was on the flesh. That's not how God said to do it. So they're doing it how they want to do it. Okay? So I hope you can already kind of see what's coming down the line. You can't do things the way you want to do it. You need to do things the way God said to do it. That's the idea. That's the takeaway. That's the principle here. And also, you'll find in Deuteronomy 18:3 that it says, from the ox or the sheep, they're allowed to have the shoulder, the jowls. I know we don't, maybe not eating a lot of facial tissue, but hey, some people like that. And the stomach is what they're allowed to have. And so I guess that's good in some kind of chili or something, some kind of stomach casserole. But that's what God said would be theirs. The rest of it goes on the altar. Leave it alone. You're not to touch it. The priests are not to touch the other parts of it. And so I want to maybe explain something if you don't know this. The Levites represented the tribe of the priesthood. Okay? They did not have land. They were not given land. They were given the priesthood. So they didn't have sheep. They didn't have animals. They didn't raise livestock because you have to have land to raise livestock. So their livelihood did depend on a portion of the sacrifice would be theirs. The problem that's going on here is that they're taking whatever they want. And then notice in verse 15 what it says. It gets even worse. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest servant would come and say to the man who sacrificed, "Give me meat for roasting to the priest, for he will not take boiled meat from you, but raw." So now they are starting to dictate to someone who offers a sacrifice, "Oh, no, we ain't taking it boiled. We're taking it, you can need to roast it for us." So that's even taking it a step further, and it's ridiculous what they're demanding from the people. Well, look at verse 16, and you'll see that not only did this practice was wrong to God's eyes, it was wrong how they were doing it, it also created problems between people. And that's another takeaway that I want you to think about. I'm not going to hammer this point, but there's a little takeaway here. When we don't do things the way God wants us to do, not only do we create a problem between us and God, we create problems between man to man, humanity to humanity, woman to woman. So sin has a ripple effect. When we sin against God, we also end up having problems with people as well. And that's exactly what happens in verse 16, is there's a problem between people. If the man said to him, okay, they should really burn the fat first. Well, that's an understatement, because nowhere in the Mosaic Law will you find that they're supposed to not burn the fat. They have to burn the fat. That's part of the sacrifice. So this man who's brought this sacrifice knows something about the Mosaic Law and how it's supposed to be done, and they kind of make it sound like he politely says, "Hey, you really shouldn't do that. You definitely should not do that." So it kind of sounds a little bit light here, but it says, "Then you may take as much as your heart desired." He would then answer him. So this is how their response would be: "No, you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force." So now you see the aggression. Not only is it not done right as far as in God's eyes, it's created a conflict between people, and now we're coming to where we're getting forceful with each other and aggressive and hostile even with each other as a result of breaching this command. This is God's command. God said you can have the right thigh, you can have the breast, you can have the stomach, you can have the shoulder. And there's nothing about, and you're never supposed to have the fat. That always gets burnt on the altar first. By the way, it's Leviticus 7:23, same chapter, Leviticus 7. It says this, it says, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, you shall not eat any fat of ox or sheep or goat, and the fat of an animal that dies naturally, and the fat of what is torn by a wild beast, but may be used in any other way, but you shall no means eat it. Whoever eats the fat of the animal of which men offer an offering made of fire by the Lord, the person who eats it shall be cut off from his people." That's what the priest should be teaching the people. Instead, they are actually violating that law. So I don't think I have to ask you kind of rhetorically, are they doing things the right way? No, not at all. They're not doing things the right way at all. Look at verse 17, and this takes it even another step further. I told you it's disappointing. It's disappointing, isn't it? When the spiritual leadership doesn't know the difference between right and wrong and doesn't even care. And then will get hostile with people on taking a stand for what's wrong. Now, hey, we may get into it, but I hope if we get into it, it's because we're trying to do the right thing and not do the wrong thing. So it's really pitiful and sad. Verse 17 says, "Therefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord. For men abhorred the offering of the Lord." Now that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy when people don't want to worship. They don't want to worship. They don't even want to bring the sacrifice anymore, because when they do, they know that it's not being done right, and I might end up having some hostility might end up getting into it with the priest over issues that we shouldn't be having. So the way that Eli's sons and Eli's family, the way they were doing things, it made people not even want to come. It made people not even want to be devout like Hannah's family, Elkanah's family, and coming year after year. It made them want to quit. I'm telling you, God is going to have the last word on people that drive people away from the Lord's house. That is a terrible, terrible thing. So that's the ministry of Eli's family. That's a great ministry, isn't it? Sad. Now let's turn our attention to Elkanah's family. And what we would call this in verses 18 through 21 is the blessing on Elkanah's family. The blessing. So ministry of Eli's family is corrupt. They did not know the Lord. But Elkanah's family, there's a blessing. Notice in verse 18, "But Samuel." See, we call that an adversative, but, however, where it's a change of direction. You're talking about one thing, but then I say, on the other hand. Yeah, that's a change of direction. So the narrative, the story here is now shifting your attention to a different direction. It says, "But Samuel ministered before the Lord even as a child." Even as a child, he is serving the Lord. You have Eli, who's got two grown boys. They are all grown men, have had years on their life experience. They've had time to learn and research the scriptures and try to do it right. And they're not doing it right. But then you have a child who is serving the Lord. Now, I don't know if that's jumping out at you, but it's meant to jump out at you as, wow, that's something. You have Samuel, who shouldn't be the one that is the example, but he is. He is serving the Lord. And it even says wearing a linen ephod, and what that means is that he's dressed up like a priest. In verse 19 and 20, it talks about the family. It says, "Moreover, his mother used to make him a little robe and bring it to him year by year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. And Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, 'The Lord give you descendants from this woman for the loan that was given to the Lord.' Then they would go to their own home." In verse 19, it's simply telling you a little bit about Hannah, about the family. The family loves Samuel. The family has given Samuel, dedicated him to the Lord, to the priesthood here, to serve, and they see him once a year is what it sounds like. But when they do, they can't wait to see him, and they bring him a new little robe every year. I'm sure that they look at the little fella and they look at how much he's grown, and then they begin to estimate, well, how big is the next robe going to be? And I'm going to write that down and take it home, and then I'm going to begin working on that little robe for him. Many commentators believe that little robe is also part of a priestly attire, some kind of robe that would be appropriate dress for him. In verse 20, you see what Eli does. And I want you to remember something about Eli. If you remember when Hannah, back in chapter 1, when she was praying, her mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. And do you remember what Eli thought? He thought she was, under the influence, intoxicated. His judgment and discernment is not right. His sons are corrupt and they do not know the Lord. They are not practicing sacrifices like they need to practice it. But this is interesting to me, is that Eli remembers Elkanah, his wife. He has Samuel there, and he blesses them. And his blessing, his desire, is so that Hannah would have more children. What's interesting is that she has more children. Verse 21, the entire family is blessed. The Lord visited Hannah so that she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the child Samuel grew before the Lord. And so you see that in verse 21, even though Eli is corrupt, he's not running a good operation there as far as obedience to the Lord, God still is working through him. And that reminds us that God works through whoever he wants to work through. When you look at the book of, here's an example. You might look at the situation in Daniel. And Nebuchadnezzar, there's a lot of debate on whether he came to know the Lord or not. But initially he was a wicked ruler. But God used those wicked rulers to accomplish his purposes. That's just an example. And he used countries and armies sometimes to accomplish his purposes. This is another situation or a case where a man who is not totally in right relationship with God, not obedient, not doing things right, still God can use whoever he wants to accomplish his goal. Now, you'll notice one thing I didn't say. Eli's family is not blessed. Elkanah's family is the one that's blessed. I've also heard this illustration as kind of another example of how sometimes God uses people. There may be a man in the community. This has happened. You may have happened here. Never darkens the door of a church, but for whatever reason, he wants to give $10,000 to the church. Never comes to church. He doesn't have a relationship with God. But there's something in his heart that tells him, if I do this good deed, it might get me somewhere with God. The church that receives that, it's a blessing. But that one who gives, I don't know what God will do with him, but I know this: if he doesn't know the Lord as his Savior, he'll still be on the same road that he was on. This kind of reminds me of that. Eli is pronouncing a blessing, and Hannah's family received a blessing. She ends up having 5 more children. You notice there at the end of verse 21, child Samuel grew before the Lord. This is excellently written. It's pointing you ahead. And what we just looked at tonight, I'm going to close right there. What we just looked at tonight is setting the stage for what we're going to see next week, with now God is going to come to Eli and going to visit him and going to talk to him. I want to leave you with 3 little things before we dismiss. First of all, this: knowing the Lord. I kind of already talked about it. It's practically identical to being obedient to the Lord. Knowing the Lord and obedience go hand in hand. So, a person's concern for obedience is going to be directly related to their knowledge of God. When you know the Lord, then you know what he expects, what he loves, what he wants. And someone who loves the Lord and knows the Lord is going to be obedient to the Lord. You don't see that here with Eli's family, but you do see it with Elkanah's family. You see it especially in the life of Samuel so far. The second thing is this: negativity, disobedience, lack of concern for the Lord's work. If that exists, you can go ahead and assume that it has negatively impacted somebody else. If that's who you are, if that's how you act, if you're a negative, toxic, disobedient person who doesn't really care about the Lord's work, understand this: you've hurt somebody. Because we see that right here. Because when people look at you, and by the way, you are teaching someone, whether you realize it or not. Everybody in here is a teacher. Everybody in here is living their life in front of somebody. And by the way, we have babes present in this congregation tonight. We have people that are young in the faith, and guess what? They're watching every one of you. They're looking at how you talk, listening to how you talk, looking at how you walk, seeing how you act. They're hearing you. They're seeing where you go, what you do. They're watching you. So just understand that everybody impacts somebody. And in this case, in verse 17, the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. So just understand, people are watching. And the last thing is this: the Lord sees. The Lord knows, and He's going to deal with those who are faithful. He's going to deal with those who are unfaithful. Eli is, and I kind of told you this a while ago, but Eli is going to be visited by a man of God. It could be Jesus. I'm not sure. I want to study it out and get it straight. But oftentimes you have a pre-incarnate visitation of Jesus in the Old Testament. It could be Jesus that talked to him. And we're going to find out what's going to happen to him and his sons. But in this text, God's blessing is affected on Elkanah's family because of their faithfulness and devotion to God. God rewards faithfulness. Let's close with a word.